record those so that we can make them available. If anyone does not want to appear, please turn your cameras off, but we recommend to keep your cameras on if you can, so we have this sense of community and of being together. Okay, over to Igor.
Hi everyone, welcome for our CUS Urban Dialogues. I was given the honor to introduce João Tonucci, who is a fellow Brazilian. João holds a bachelor in economics, a master in architecture and urbanism, and a PhD in geography. So such a mix gave him the position of professor of urban and regional economics in the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He's also a researcher on the Observatorio of the Metropolis. It's a translation of the Observatory of the Metropolises in Brazil. And now he's a visiting fellow, as you know, here in the CUS. The topic today is focused on the context of Belo Horizonte, which is the third biggest city in Brazil, and he will present his work on the increasing heterogeneity of informal land development, which he will show is very much entangled with the speculative logic. As a fellow CUS member and a fellow Brazilian, for me, it's an honor to have you here, João. And I believe I speak on behalf of the CUS community when I say it is a privilege to learn firsthand about your latest work. So without further ado, João Tonucci.
Okay, thank you so much, Igor, for this very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here and very glad also to have known all of you. And first of all, I'd like to thank Maria and the Center for Urban Studies for welcoming me here in Amsterdam. Also my co-supervisor, Roger Caio at the City Institute in Toronto. And of course, the Urban Studies Foundation for its international fellowship program, which allowed me to be here with you. I also like to thank the CUS team and Francesca for organizing this Urban Dialogue series, and all the UVA professors, students and researchers with whom I have the chance to exchange and collaborate so far. And I'm really excited and honored to be here doing this presentation, which I entitled Property at the Margins, Entanglements of Informality and Speculation in Brazilian Metropolitan Peripheries. So let me start with a quick story. Back in 2017 and 2018, I was directly involved in a collaboration project between our university and the Metropolitan Agency of Belo Horizonte in order to update the local master plans of 11 municipalities in the region. In one of those many participatory workshops we held, the mayor and the local councillors of the Rio Manso municipality, a small municipality in the region, raised considerable concern about informal land subdivisions. That was a common topic in all cities, and public officials and also local inhabitants were wary of the uncontrollable urban growth due to informal land development, which caused severe problems in all cities. We all knew about that at the time and also had been trying to map these informal territories and propose different forms of urban policy towards them. However, what was remarkably interesting about that particular meeting, you have the picture of it, you can see it when it happened, was that the local authorities, meaning the mayor and the local councillors, started to point to each other and started to talk to each other about who was the owner, the partner, or the developer of each particular irregular subdivision in the city. So they all confessed to us that they were directly involved in all the informal land development in a rather shamelessly way. That's when it became clear to me that although we knew a lot about the territory through maps and zoning laws, we knew nothing about the process itself and even less about the actors behind it. And that what just gave us the motivation to put on this project. This is a large 5-year project, which I have been coordinating since 2017, 2018, looking at exactly the role of informal land developers and the peripheral expansion over the last 2 decades in Belo Horizonte. I've been working with some collaborators, such as a colleague of mine, Daniel Freitas, at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and under the Metropolis Observatory Research Network. So this research project started trying to understand the role of those informal land developers. Those are often invisible, understudied, and ordinary city makers in Latin America. And they act through the illegal parceling of rural or peri-urban lands, through the development of precarious subdivisions, and through the selling of underserviced and irregular plots of land and lots. They were a key actor during the period of rapid urbanization between 1940 and 1980 in Belo Horizonte, and associated with home ownership, auto construction, bus transit. They were one of the main important drives of peripheral urbanization. But after the 80s, they started to fade, and then people stopped paying attention to them. And what we have found in our research is that there is still a widespread and recognized phenomena going on. So there's persistency under new conditions, such as economic restructuring, neoliberalism, and financialization. We have also been looking at a greater heterogeneity of actors than they used to be between the 40s and the 80s, different kinds of irregular subdivisions, and a very complex regulatory framework. So we try to develop a multidimensional analytical framework to take a look at the role of the developers, but also paying attention to the state, to policy, to regulations, and also to geographical variation in the metropolitan region. And then we wanted to look on the literature to get some help to understand and to conceptualize those informal land developers. And we are not very lucky with that, because we found that although property remains a critical topic in urban studies, most research on real estate has focused on formal property markets on the global East and North. And on the other hand, urban informality literature tends to privilege squatted settlements, subaltern practices, and downplay commodification and market actors dynamics. So we wanted to kind of bridge this gap and try to shift the attention to more commodified ways of informal access to land and housing in the global South. And then we started to develop this theoretical framework, also trying to bridge this gap between the informality and property and real estate literature, trying to look at how we could look at informality more as a logic process permeated with speculative and rentership practices. Think more of informality as opportunity, and try to look more at it more like from housing provision to land-based accumulation, rent extraction, and speculation. And then we served the literature and found some very interesting entry points. I'm not going to go through all of them here. We don't have time for that, but those have been the alphas and theories and concepts which we have been applying in our work. In terms of methodology, we developed a case study with mixed methods. There were obvious challenges regarding lack of official data, very evasive actors, and also the question of the pandemic, because part of our field work was scheduled to take place in 2020. We developed then a partnership with the Metropolitan Agency, which is the public body responsible for overseeing metropolitan planning and urban development in the metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte. And that gave us access to 3 different set of databases: the subdivision permits, inspection of irregular subdivisions in the last decade, and detailed inspection reports also for this period. We also developed classification of developers based on the federal revenue record. We conducted semi-structured interviews with public-private actors, critical reading of land development regulatory framework in Brazil, the fieldwork in Southwestern metropolitan municipalities, which we had previously to the pandemic conducted in 2018, and also visited and tried to get some data through the developers' websites when they have it, and to real estate advertising portals. And just to give some context, Igor has already mentioned a little bit about Belo Horizonte. Belo Horizonte is the planned capital of the state. It's an inland state of Minas Gerais. It was planned and it was born in the late 19th century. And during the between the 40s and the 80s, it experienced extremely rapid growth and metropolization through industrialization, rural migration, and also peripheral urbanization. So the typical Brazilian periphery expansion processes. In 1973, it was created as a metropolitan region, at that time with 14 municipalities, and now it has expanded formally to encompass 34 different municipalities in the of this metropolitan region, with something between 5 and 6 million inhabitants, making it the third largest metropolitan region in Brazil after São Paulo and Rio. Around 20% of that population live in squatted settlements. Its economy is mostly based on mining, metallurgy, care manufacturing, services, public sector, and of course, real estate. And it has strong links to the main political and economic centers in the country. And in the last 2 decades, which is the period we are looking at, it experienced the boom and bust of the economy and also of the real estate markets, large-scale projects, some of them associated with the World Cup, mass housing programs, slum upgrading programs, and also a lot of new housing occupation of land for housing. And then we have to start this by taking a look at how land is regulated in Brazil. Otherwise, you want to be able to understand it, informality. And in Brazil, land subdivision and urban development are regulated by all government levels. We have several laws at the federal level, like the Land Institute, the Urban Land Subdivision from 1979, which is the main law regarding urban land development, but also the City Institute, Metropolitan Institute, Land Regularization Law, among others, like the Civil Code. At the state level, we have the several metropolitan laws and decrees, specifically in Minas Gerais since 2006. And each municipality, each of the 34 municipalities has its own master plan with its own local zoning and its own subdivision law. For a developer to get an urban subdivision permit, it has to apply for the municipality and the metropolitan authority. If it wants to have a subdivision in rural area, it has to go for the INCRA, which is the public body responsible for agrarian reform in Brazil, which is completely absent from this process. And the developer, if she wants to develop in formal ways, has some responsibilities like secure the permits, subdivide the parcel into lots, develop it, putting roads, infrastructure, services, donate parts of land, and to register sales as well. And this is a quote from an interview with one of the urban planners of the Metropolitan Agency. So I remember when we started working there at the agency, analyzing the projects, the girl who was already working there taught us, you do this and that, this law, this and such. Then we went to read the law, we read the law, we saw that there were reference to 3 more. Then we read this 3 and there were 2 more, and we were making a list of all the legislation that we had to look at. The list never ended. We said, wait, let's stop here, let's just use this one. So this gives just a picture of how complicated and complex the regulatory framework is, and especially how the state also uses and deploys this kind of entangled law. And at the same time, we're looking at not only at the regulation, but at how irregularities are policed, how they are treated by the Metropolitan Authority, which means the Metropolitan Agency, which has police powers over land development. It can inspect irregular land developments. That is the main source of all our data. And we have at least 5 types of irregularity: no permits, non-compliance with approved project, non-compliance with administrative order, misleading advertisement, and non-compliance with urban regulation. It has to work in 50 municipalities. It has 1 manager and only 2 inspectors. So it's completely lack of staff for all this work that has to be done in terms of policing and inspecting informality. The inspection prosecution time usually takes 2 to 4 years, while the subdivision, a regular subdivision, can start in a few days, a few months, and go up to 1 year. So there's this great mismatch between times of the planning time and the developer time here. There's also this lack of law knowledge by public and private actors, low penalties, the fines are extremely cheap, a very lengthy and bureaucratic process, and of course, all political costs associated with it. So only 5 to 10% of all the inspected developments, which are by no means all the irregular developments in the area, only 5 to 10% are effectively regularized at the end of those processes. Also, an interview, quote, "Our great difficulty was having data to be able to carry out the inspection. We often had the coordinates of the place, but we didn't know who owned the land. We couldn't find the answer anywhere. We didn't have information on the delimitation of the subdivision, which, when it started, how it was transacted, so it was very difficult. In many cases, we were unable to find because we could not find the owner of the land," end quote. And a different land inspector, quote, "Inspecting subdivisions is an action that brings political damage. Many politicians are involved in these subdivisions. They go on destroying the city, several subdivision problems, several, it's scary. So you can see that they become millionaires because of this subdivision process," end quote. And now this is what it looks like. We were able to create this map with all the database. We can see that there's a large urban footprint of informal land developments. Those are not all, but almost all of the inspected irregular land developments over the last 10 years. This is very much like a leapfrog development, loss of rural areas, encroachment on protected areas, very low density, fragmented and dispersed urban fabric. They are very distant from the city center. Almost all of them lack some kind of infrastructure, very poor public mobility, and large land vacancy in almost all of them, except for the older ones. And then we started to look at how differentiated are those subdivisions and informal land developments across the metropolitan area. We found that 57% of all inspected subdivisions are concentrated in only 8 municipalities. And they are also concentrated either on the northern vector, which received the majority of public and private investment in the period, or in the southern vector, which is known for being the place of the elite gated communities. We also found that we have 2 different kinds of location. They may be adjacent to the main built-up area, so more close to the urban core, let's put it that way, or they can be isolated in rural areas or close to smaller city towns. In poorer municipalities, most of the inspection is due to the lack of infrastructure or squatting, and informal and formal land markets develop side by side in metropolitan expansion areas. That was one of the starting conclusions that we found out when looking at the territory. So we could look at least at 3 different kinds of territories or municipalities regarding formal land development. There are those which have peripheral and precarious subdivisions, and those are mostly from the 80s, 90s, some older and some new. Then there are those municipalities which are experiencing land valorization and are well in infrastructure, well connected, and there are also the pressure coming from gated communities in rural areas across the metropolitan region. And this is comparative maps between, on the left, you can see the total area of approved subdivisions in almost 20 years. So this is the formal land development process. And to your right, the total area of inspected subdivisions, like from 2009 to 2018, and they are at the same scale. And you can see that there is more area that was irregular in 10 years than that was formal in almost 20 years. And at the same time, you can see that there is a match between the areas which are mostly pressured by formal development by real estate company and those areas where we could find more traces of irregular informal land development. also from our interviews, quote, what generates more demand for inspection is the issue of land subdivision in rural areas. That's 70% of our demands, end quote. And another staff from the Metropolitan Agency tells us that, quote, land in urban expansion and rural areas, it is much cheaper. It has this possibility of being fractioned, so it ends up happening. In addition to this, we have legislation that is fragile, because when I have the possibility to identify this and to act, the legal order is so fragile that sometimes the offender, he manages to defend himself and come out unscathed. And most of these people only have the purchase and sale contract, and they think they have a title deed, but they don't have the awareness that it is informal. This is the worst situation we have in terms of land tenure irregularity that happens between the rural and the urban areas. And then we started to pay attention not only to these diverse geographies of irregular informal land development, but also to who are the actors behind it. So a very, what we've been calling a heterogeneous landscape of informal developers. We found that different from the previous period, which had a very specific type of popular informal land developer, we found very different kinds of actors operating on these markets. We have companies, which can be small, medium, or even some large companies, real estate companies. Some individuals or natural persons, usually they are middlemen who do some kind of brokerage, or they are the landowners, smaller landowners. Also public bodies, many municipalities and housing corporations, some professional associations, such as police, teachers associations, firemen associations, some condominiums, and even some religious organizations, some churches which are building informal land subdivisions. Among the top inspected developers are companies, and then comes individuals, and in the third place, the public bodies. And this third one is very interesting because we're trying to understand, well, how is that the state produces informal land developments? See, because it's the state that creates the law. So the state subdivisions, some of them are kind of subdivisions that were assumed by municipalities after 1979, after the approval of the main law on land development in Brazil, but also includes irregular social housing. So sometimes a housing authority, a housing corporation, or even municipality, because of pressure to construct or lack of resources, or even disregard by the law, build some kind of informal land development for social housing as well. We have as a typical repeat offenders, rural fractioners and the popular developers who were there even before the 80s. We also have a differentiation between deliberate informality by companies, which they know what they are doing and they know how to work with and against the law. And sometimes a lot of these informalities unintended, especially when it's done by individuals, because many times they don't know the law, there's a lack of information, or they just commit some error in the process. There's also no preponderance of major agents. There's no huge, like a big capital into this, but smaller fractions of capital and individuals. There's a lot of dispersion and concentration in very particular regions. And also we found a lot of clientelist links. So links between landowners, developers, local elites, notaries, and politicians, especially in the smaller municipalities. And in some cases, not very often, not very common in Belo Horizonte, but this is not the case in Brazil, it differs. Also the role of gangs and land mafias, meaning land swindlers who subdivide land which they don't even own. So there's it's a more criminal offense here in terms of property rights. So a different planner from the Metropolitan Agency told us that, quote, nowadays having an urban property is much more advantageous than having a rural property. This is very clear. If, for example, I don't do anything on my land, if I don't do anything in 5 years, it values 2 to 3 times. And so there is no economic or financial investment that has this return. And also, quote, and then this process of dividing up this type of land happens with high-income owners and low-income owners. High-income landowners, they know, they are aware of the value of their property, so they will act conscientiously. Low-income homeowners, they don't make the conscience, they don't have the conscience, sorry, but they are sometimes seduced by the property market to do that. And then we try to understand this movement from peripheral and popular urbanization to more elite forms of urbanization regarding land development. So peripheral and popular urbanization, which used to dominate informal land markets between the 40s and the 80s, was mainly about auto construction in peripheral areas. People would usually buy land for housing needs, and of course, some form of long-term savings for poor families. The lots which are sold in these markets vary from 100 to 300 square meters, and the prices are very low. They used to be much lower, but they're still accessible to some families which are not so desperately poor. So it can be something between 5,000 reais to 50,000 reais. And those informal, peripheral, popular subdivisions are usually done by landowners, by middlemen, by developers, by some associations, swindlers, and also by some public bodies, which, as I mentioned, try to put some social housing through this process. It's mostly based on self-financing, usually goes with some form of arrangement between the buyer and the developer, usually for 5 years. Or, which is very interesting, there's a lot of advertise which they exchange the land for another land, another home, or cars. So we see a lot of advertisements like this, which we sell or we exchange for a car. That's showing how cheap it is, and also showing how people are desperate in trying to get some kind of liquidity out of the markets. But then we are moving to more suburban, middle class, and elite informalities. So now what we are seeing, we have been seeing over these last 2 decades, is now that informal, irregular subdivisions are now more about gated communities and small farms in rural or environmentally sensitive areas. They're not auto-constructed for housing needs, but for second homes, for leisure, for investment, and also for buy-to-let in some cases. And who does this? Usually landowners, some associations, and also some real estate companies. So we have process of self-financing with some form of down payment and installments for almost 10 years in some cases. But all of them, they are not financed by banks, by the formal circuits of finance, exactly because they are informal, so they don't have the title deeds necessary for going through it. So here is our urban planner A again, quote, "In the past, you see these occupations for low-income people, especially in the 80s and 90s. We were going through an economic and social crisis, and then suddenly that started to change. People started to see hope ahead, and then they will invest in something. Today, we see a different movement, which is the landowner. He's a little more aware of the real estate valorization, which he will have most of the time in an informal way. So the process is starting to reverse. Today, we have more processes for second homes for people of medium and high income and more. And when these areas are occupied by low-income people, it is because it was done in very bad faith. So the situation, unfortunately, happens to those who are not educated, to those who are educated, to those who have no money, to those who have money. And then I think that in the middle, there is the real estate market, which makes this articulation. Coming to a conclusion, we then started to think more that informality, especially land and housing informality, is increasingly in our context, in the Brazilian context, increasingly defined by informal developers and market dynamics of land-based accumulation, rent extraction, and speculation in boom and bust. And that is one of the interesting things. The 5-year crisis we have been on in Brazil also in the real estate sector, has not affected very much the informal sector. Also, we have this very complex, elitist, overlapping regulatory framework, also combined with weak law enforcement and tacit tolerance by the state, meaning that the state induces informality. It creates opportunities for different forms of informality. We also seen this move from cheap access to land for the urban poor to land investment and speculation by middle classes and elites. And this links to the housing crisis in Brazil, because that was one of the forms that the urban poor had access to land in the last decades. And now even this frontier of peripheralization, of peripheral urbanization, is now more closed, because it's now being occupied by middle classes and elites who are looking for investment opportunities, speculation opportunities. There's also a decoupling of land informality from now to construction, as I showed. Also a competition with corporate financialized real estate capital, mass-produced housing and occupations, which are also looking at the periphery. And we have found this huge differentiation within informality. This is something also building on previous work on and extending this work on urban informality, looking at heterogeneous landscape of ordinary developers and also variegated geographies of informality in the metropolitan area. And through that, we came to think more of informality it's wrong there. It's think more like speculation through informality as a rentiership logic, which is born not out of necessity, but much more out of opportunity. And I will end with this quote from one of the most remarkable informal land developers we had the chance to interview last year. So, quote, "I think for sure this cryptocurrency thing, Bitcoin, is a pyramid. They are going to make a loss. So land development will be the best deal in the world. Buying the lot will be the best deal. It will be very good. There will be no problem, because the cryptocurrencies will still cause a very big loss all over the world. You don't know who owns it, where I can complain if my money disappears. So it's just better to buy land and property." And okay, thanks very much for your time, and looking forward to your comments and feedbacks.
Thank you, João. Thank you. Such a nice presentation. I think it's absolutely fascinating to shed some light on how in some contexts in the global south, especially in Brazil, informal arrangement or informal arrangement becomes more kind of the general rule than the formal arrangements, right? And how sometimes us as researchers are lacking knowledge of this dynamics due to several challenges that we have, as you pointed out, from, for example, lack of data. Anyway, thank you for presenting. I would like to open the floor. Since we don't have a very big group, please just raise your digital or your physical hand if you have your camera on, so I can give the word to you. Anyone with a question? Yes, Fred, go ahead.
Well, hi, thank you, João. It was very, very interesting, and I really appreciated I think it's a very important research, especially for Brazil, that, there is still some kind of misunderstanding about the role of informal development in the cities. But I have a very specific question. I don't know if you were able to get the information of who actually owned the land that are being developed. It's a public land, or it's a private, or like a rural, private rural property that being developed. Do you have this information?
Should we make a round if there are other questions, or should I just, Maria? Yeah.
It's adding on to Fred. It's a quick question. I can come back with others.
Go ahead, Maria.
Is there a land cadastre, a national land cadastre, or is there a gray area that enables these things to happen? So it's a clarification.
João, I think it's nice if we also keep kind of as a more just a discussion between us, a talk. So you can intervene.
I can add another question since while people collect their thoughts. You did mention, João, and for me it's so important, this entangled law and regulatory framework. You said that it's, I can't remember, you used a very nice expression, but the state is actually enabling this process. And of course, this entangled law and entangled regulatory framework is one way of precisely making sure that this cannot be properly observed, and even people who are checking, they don't know what to check. So I wonder whether there is a broader public discussion about that. And just to let you know that, obviously Brazil is not the only place where this happens, but to what extent this is a conscious effort from the part of the state not to regulate, and what came out of your research, and then what would be the key reasons or presented reasons or ideologies or rationales for doing that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for those questions. I will start with Fred, and I think they are all somehow related. Who owns the land? The metropolitan region of Belo Horizonte has not a very strong, let's say, tradition of public lands on rural areas. So they are mostly small to medium farms. They are also not very large private latifundios or huge, plantation-like farms. They are mostly small to medium farms, which are also not very productive, which have also not doing very well in terms of rural production, although some of them, of course, have a very important role in terms of producing food for the city, but most of them are like very impoverishing, small scale and medium farms with a lot of cattle. So not much production, but more cattle. And this also connects to Maria's question, if there's a land cadastre. That's a huge problem in Brazil, is the kind of uncontrol of who owns land. This is a huge question, and of course, it has been like this since we started as a colony centuries ago. The idea that land is kind of a black box because there's so much power and economic interest is involved with land. So at least like James Hawson has a very interesting argument about this, that this idea that there is, it's not a question of not having law, which many times it's presented as this, as a lawless land, but in having so much law that only some are able to use this law in its own favor. So what we have is this very complex tangle that I was talking about land and development framework, which of course some groups, some elite groups, they know how to work through it. They know how to explore those opportunities that arise through this law. And at the same time, this law blocks access to land to the majority of the population. This is the other side of the problem. So there's a huge inequality in terms of access to land and housing, and this kind of law has not made things easier. So there is not a national land cadastre. There is a rural cadastre that it's been growing. It was implemented during the last government, and but not in the urban areas. So there's also a big, like a black box. We don't know who owns the land, and that's very challenging for the planners. That's what I was trying to show by that quote, because they don't even know who owns the land. So who they are looking after, who are they going to persecute and go after? So there's a sense of powerlessness by those who work in this kind of inspection, and they act as a staff in those places. So I think what's more related to all of this is the power of property and the role that property plays in structuring society and space in Brazilian society. And I guess in many other Latin American contexts which experience the same kind of dynamic.
Thanks, João. I think Dan has a question for you.
Hi, João. Thank you for this interesting presentation. There's one question or aspect in particular that I was wondering about, and you just mentioned it's the issue of property. So when you look at property, I think one of the key aspects is that you can be able to say this is yours, and that this right for you to exclude others from using or accessing that property is guaranteed by another party, such as the state in many countries. I wonder how, in the context of land informality and illegal subdivisions, if this sort of uncertainty regarding your absolute control of property also affects people's sense of control or their investment decisions. I mean, when you cannot guarantee that the state will stand in for your property title, it also makes for a more uncertain investment, I imagine. Did you notice any of this in your fieldwork?
That's a great question. This is a very challenging thing related to property in Brazil, because you have kind of two sides of this thing. At the same time that the state is very fond of keeping private properties and guaranteeing private properties, at the same time it doesn't regulate it very far. But meaning, why those informal land developers do what they do with their land is because they feel entitled to it. They feel like, well, I own the land, it's mine, and even if I don't have a proper title deed, and this is one of the other important aspects, people don't need title deeds or the formal registration of property to feel that they own the property. And that's, of course, how the informal markets operate, because they are based on different institutions which work in parallel or in connection to the state. So I think this creates some kind of security, because it's not a complete insecure, uncertain ground. But of course, there are a lot of uncertainty and insecurity, because in all land markets, there's a lot of speculation involved necessarily. So people don't know exactly what's going on. And when I interviewed some of those informal land developers, the sense of speculation in the rationale behind the business was very, very strong. Well, some things work, some don't. Some things we don't know what's going on, and sometimes we just leave a subdivision because we kind of lost control of it. So I think this is part of what I've been trying to characterize as a speculative regime in informal land markets. Not sure if I answered you, but yeah.
Yeah. Wrong. Yeah. Okay. I'll give floor to Frank. He has a question.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you very much, João. This was a great presentation. I work on quite similar topics of informality in Rio. So I have two questions, maybe that try to, let's say, compare. I don't know if it's the right word, but so on the one hand, you mentioned very peripherally the presence of gangs, also, or land mafias. So I was wondering, also related to the question of Dan, in Rio, the land mafias produce some kind of certainty because they manage to negotiate between politicians and small landholders. I don't know if that's the case also in Belo Horizonte, maybe. So maybe that's a question. What's the importance of gangs, and how can they even be, let's say, securing actors or presenting some kind of certainty in the land property? And the other one is about elite informality. So in the literature, I was always looking for a good definition of elite informality. There's not very much. Ananya Roy has worked a bit about it, but also others. And I wondered how that, let's say, compares maybe to corruption. So again, in Rio, elite informality is related to the family of Bolsonaro. And they can, so Flavio Bolsonaro is also involved in land development, for example, but that then is very much a corruption thing, maybe. So maybe you can explain a bit more what elite informality is, how that's defined, because I think there's a real gap in the literature, to my knowledge, at least.
Thanks so much, Frank, and also nice to meet you finally online. We have spoken before through email, so it's nice to see you here And thanks for putting Belo Horizonte also in context with other Brazilian cities such as Rio, because some aspects of what I'm talking about here, of course, are present in other cities, but each city has very particular, and I would say that Rio has completely particular informality context process in Brazil, where we have the role of militias and drug gangs and land mafias much more powerful and articulated than in Belo Horizonte. So in Belo Horizonte, we still don't see that. I'm not sure if for how long it's going to stay like this, but we still don't see like the power of this kind of group. So what we see is the power of drug dealers and drug gangs in land occupations, which I also done some study before on them, housing occupations, so squatted land, not bought land. But soon after the occupation starts to get recognition and to be organized, they started to have to deal with this kind of foreign, actor, which is usually related to the drug traffic, which becomes part of the informal land markets inside the occupations. So it's a very complete different dynamic. I'm not sure exactly what is found in Rio regarding to that. And in terms of light informality, I'm also not very aware of the definitions. I've been looking through it, and it varies a lot on which elite were we talking about? Those who develop the land, or those who buy the land, those who live on the land. So what I have found here in my research is that there are some, like middle class and very high income groups who are working as developers themselves. So usually formalized companies, but also some groups, families and friends who sometimes gather together. Well, let's buy a farm on the outskirts and subdivide it and create a small condominium just between us. So kind of a small community of equals, but in a complete private way. So we also see this kind of light informality happening in Belo Horizonte. And sometimes it's linked to corruption. Sometimes also, as you mentioned very well, corruption structures the deals. So structures and gives some kind of certainty for the land, especially at the local level, where there's a very association between politicians and landowners and developers. They all know themselves. Sometimes they are the same people, and but it's not always associated with corruption. So there are some developments which are not necessarily being done through bribes or doing through this kind of things.
João, I have a follow-up question then on this, that's related to something that I was thinking to your presentation. In my own research in Brazil, I also struggle to sometimes navigate and to get inside this kind of illegal networks that are happening there, and people think that Brazil sometimes is kind of a homogeneous country, but it's not easy to enter in a community that is quite different from what you're coming from. You can easily see yourself as kind of an outsider there. So I was wondering, how much was this a challenge for you on this research? Maybe you could explain a bit. And I know that, okay, criminality was not such a big issue there, but I'm pretty sure there are other challenges that you face.
Yeah, that's a very important methodological question. Thanks for pointed this out, Igor. And we, of course, had some challenges regarding the fieldwork and also interviewing the developers, because of many of them, they don't want to talk. They don't want to talk to the university. They don't want to talk. They don't want to do anything that looks like public authority, because they know they are on the other side of the law. They are operating on the margins of the law. So anything that puts them at the smaller risk, they want to get away. But at the same time, there are some very outspoken ones who completely tells you everything about what they do without no shame. And also there are some who justify it. Well, I'm doing this on a public purpose because I'm selling cheaper land for poor people. So there are also this idea of the heroic popular land developer who is able to do this. So it's very different in terms of that. But because we could not have easy access directly to them, and this is a very important characteristic of this kind of research, because you cannot do this with them. So we had to rely on how the state sees them and how the state creates data over them, and put this in a critical way, of course. But we talked much more with the state actors, with agents, with the staff who works with inspection, than with the developers themselves, and trying to also bridge this gap with some field work, which was also not always safe. There were times when we felt unsafe in some particular places, because exactly you don't know what's going on there, and who's the boss and who owns that place. And but yeah, so this kind of board the question of criminality and challenging in field work in this kind of unsafe environments. But at the same time shows that it can be done, because we heard a lot about it. Well, you cannot do any research on informal land development because you don't have data to this. And then that's what we try to kind of show.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. And I feel like even at some point, even in Rio, which I did some research in communities there with when there's like a community gang that takes control of the space. I feel like even in Rio, sometimes it's even easier because you know who you need to have authorization to enter in that place, right? But I feel like in places like they're so scattered the power, like in Belo Horizonte, how do you navigate that? But anyway, anyone else has because we're a bit running out of time. Anyone else has okay, we have two questions. Okay, let's try to answer both. So Paula and then Fernando.
So thank you for that very enlightening presentation. It got me really thinking about the mechanism we have in Brazil called uso capião. So the mechanism to ensure tenure after a certain time that the land has been occupied. And I wonder if this kind of played into your research, and maybe even some of this more informed developers could be even considering this kind of mechanism to enable then this land to become later on legal.
Hi, João. Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask you about the state-induced informality, and I wanted to know if that included the inspectors that you interviewed, if that was something that is also happening at the level of the city scale.
Okay, thanks, Paula. That's a very important question. In fact, I didn't pay much attention to it in the presentation, but there is a very important thing about Brazilian land law is that at the same time that it's very fond of protecting private land rights, there's also some possibilities of like this kind of possessive acquisition, which is the uso capião, different forms of acquisition which are based on tenure, on only the occupation, the productive occupation over time of land. So it's kind of a contradictory source. And what this creates is the expectancy of regularization. And this is extremely important for the working of those kinds of markets. There are places which don't have this. And this is usually the places where you won't find a structure informal land markets, because developers themselves, but also the buyers, have to have the expectancy that at some point in time, it can be 5, it can be 10, it can be 15 arduous, very difficult years of struggle through the regularization process, which is very complicated, but they know that at some time they have security of tenure, and at the same time, at the end of the process, they have the infrastructure or even a title. So you're completely right. The idea of uso capião and other forms of regularization are very important for structuring this kind of process. And Fernando, I think you asked about the state-induced informality at the local municipal level. Yes, definitely. We have been looking at metropolitan and the local level. And I would say that at the local level, the complicity is stronger you know, what happens in Belo Horizonte, you know, and this is also very distinct because this is one of the only metropolitan regions which has this kind of metropolitan policy scheme. Most of metropolitan regions in Brazil don't have this kind of structure, and metropolitan regions don't play this kind of role. So it's completely local level. And at the local level, especially in the smaller and poorer municipalities, there is almost no control of land use. In many times they have a local plan, but they don't use it. And usually they don't even ask for permits for developments, although this is illegal. So yeah, I would say that so there's a conflict between those levels in terms of it.
I was wondering if the inspectors themselves think like in their work, they're actually, you know, contributing to the problem. I mean, I you know, in the interviews that you conducted, if they express, you know, any kind of
yes, definitely. They have all kinds of problems, not only of finding the place, of knowing how, but in some cases they experience some fear and violent threats. So I don't know if you saw this, but I put a picture. There's a kind of a team where we have 2 inspectors and 2 policemen, because they are now trying to cooperate. So the policemen, the military policemen, they go together to the inspection in some cases. In some cases, it's the environmental policy to give protection to those inspectors, because they usually are very, in a very weak situation. At the same time, they have this kind of power that comes through the state. Also, in many times, they told us about this, that of course there's pressure sometimes within the state. Well, don't look at that place, don't look at that developer, because they all have political connections and links. So I'm also very aware that our database is not complete. It's very biased by a lot of different circumstances like this.
Okay, João, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to close this session. It was a pleasure to hear a bit more about your work, João. And since we have here at UVA, yeah, we can keep in touch and have this conversation further. So thank you everyone for coming. I'd also like to bring attention for our next Urban Dialogue. So please, Maria and Francesca, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's on the 29th of March. We'll have a presentation from David Evers, is that correct? On the COVID measures towards environmental transition and justice. So
and Francesca will send a reminder and details, but it should already be in your diaries as an Outlook calendar invitation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, João. It was a real honor and pleasure. It was such a rich presentation and dialogue, and we'll all be in touch. Igor and Francesca, maybe you can